Have you ever, really stopped to think about how society structures these kind of invisible threads actually shape our lives? I mean, everything, our health, our opportunities, where we end up. It's kind of wild how these big abstract ideas become, well, real life in a doctor's office or, in a patient story you might hear someday. Welcome, everyone, to Deep Dive. So today we are diving deep, really deep, into social inequality. And this one, we specifically tailored it for you, especially if you're a pre-med student hitting the books for the MCAT. Our goal, to pull out the absolute must-know insights from all the research out there on social inequality. We want to make these complex ideas super clear, give you those aha moments you need for the Psych Soc section. Content category 10A, big stuff. And guiding us through all the sociology and psychology bits is Dr. Jordan Carter. Welcome. It's great to have you here to help us unpack all this.
Thanks. It's great to be here. This is such a critical topic. So just to give everyone a roadmap for today, we're going to start with the basics, like what is social inequality? We'll talk about core concepts, SES, socioeconomic status, and the different barriers people face. Then we'll get into social class, things like class consciousness, and also this really fascinating idea, false consciousness. It's often misunderstood.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely interested in that one.
Then we'll look at how space matters, spatial inequality. Think residential segregation, how communities are divided, environmental justice issues, even things like food deserts. After that, we'll tackle health and healthcare disparities head on, how inequality literally affects people's health. And then we'll zoom out. Global inequalities, income, wealth, gender, even carbon emissions, which is a newer angle, but really important.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to cover.
It is, but it all connects. We'll wrap up thinking about solutions, policy ideas, the role of social determinants of health, or SDOH, in making things more equal, and just to stress all of this, directly relevant for understanding that social context of health on your MCAT.
Absolutely essential. And hey, speaking of essential resources, if you're looking for more MCAT Psych Soc help, definitely check out the MCAT Psych Pulse podcast. It's on mdtalk.substack.com. Really great stuff over there.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Social inequality, what are we actually talking about? At its core, it's about barriers. Systemic barriers that stop certain groups in society. Maybe they're disenfranchised, maybe they just lack power from getting access to important resources, things run by institutions.
Right, and it's not just random bad luck, it's baked into the system somehow.
Exactly. It's about systemic disadvantages, not just individual struggles.
And pulling from the AAMC materials, for the MTAT prep, these barriers are really concrete things like language differences. Imagine not understanding your doctor or just where you happen to live, your zip code dictating access to good hospitals or schools. And then there's SES socioeconomic status, which will unpack immigration status, race, ethnicity. The key thing is these often overlap, right? They pile up on people.
That's a really vital point. They intersect and compound each other. And we have to be clear. Institutionalized racism, systemic discrimination, these aren't just things from the past. They are active forces today, stopping people from getting equal access. Understanding this, really seeing it from a social justice angle, is fundamental if you want to tackle those health disparities we see everywhere. For you as future doctors, recognizing this is key to giving fair, effective care.
Okay, so you mentioned SES, socioeconomic status. That seems central here. Can you break down what makes up SES? Maybe use an analogy to show how powerful it is.
Sure. So SES isn't just one thing. It's usually seen as a combo of three main parts. Income, how much money you make, education, how much schooling you've had, and occupation, what kind of job you do. These three are usually pretty closely linked. And together they kind of determine your position in the social hierarchy. Think of SES like a master key. Someone with high SES, they've got this key that unlocks doors to all sorts of resources.
What kind of doors?
Well, quality healthcare, obviously. Yeah. Better schools for their kids, powerful professional networks that open up even more opportunities. But someone with low SES, their key fits very few locks. They face real struggles getting those same things. It also becomes this cycle that's hard to break out of.
That master key idea really clicks. And we see examples all the time, right? Like the difference between, say, a doctor or a lawyer and someone working a minimum wage job. It's not just about having fancy stuff. That wealth gap hits hard. It affects health outcomes, diet, living conditions. Can you afford preventative care? It affects getting into college, graduating. It affects, your overall social mobility. Can you move up? Or even just stay where you are?
Precisely. And this leads us right into the idea of social class. The fact that these resources and opportunities are distributed so unevenly creates layers in society, what sociologists call social stratification. It's like a ladder or maybe different tiers.
Right.
And understanding where you are on that ladder and what power you might have collectively with others on the same rung, that's really important.
So social stratification is these layers, these hierarchies. And within that, you mentioned class consciousness. What exactly is that?
Class consciousness is basically, well, first, being aware of your social rank, your class position in this system. But it's more than just knowing. It's also realizing that people in your same boat, they have shared interests and potentially shared power. Power to influence things, maybe even change the system.
Like unions.
Exactly. When workers realize, hey, we're all facing similar issues, let's organize, that's class consciousness in action. It's crucial for understanding how social movements start, how people push back against the status quo in societies that are divided by class. It's recognizing we're in this together.
Okay, now this next one, false consciousness. This sounds complex. It's a Marxist idea, you said. Can you explain this misalignment from reality? Why is it seen as such a roadblock?
Right, false consciousness. From a Marxist viewpoint, it's the idea that the way society is set up, the material conditions, the dominant ideas, the institutions, actually misleads the working class, the proletariat and others. Misleads them about how capitalism really works, about the exploitation and inequality that are kind of built into the system.
So it hides the truth.
In a way, yes. It makes the existing class structure seem natural or fair, or maybe just the only way things can be. It basically legitimizes the whole system. And the effect is, it stops the exploited groups from seeing their true shared interests and taking action to change things. It's like wearing blinders that the system itself provides.
So it's not just that people are ignorant, it's that they're being actively steered away from seeing their real situation.
That's the core idea. And people like Michael Parenti, a political analyst, looked into this. He argued that working-class folks in the U.S. don't just choose to act against their interests out of nowhere. He suggested their political understanding gets stunted or distorted by misinformation, disinformation, by a media landscape that only presents a very narrow range of options and rules out real alternatives.
So the media plays a big role in shaping this, or distorting it.
According to Parenti, yes. It creates this ideological confusion, making it hard for people to figure out what's really in their best interest economically.
John Wiener's analysis of that book, What's the Matter with Kansas, by Thomas Frank, that seems like a really clear example of this in action.
It really is. Wiener discussed how Frank's book explored this spread of false consciousness in parts of the Great Plains. He pointed out how certain conservative media figures, talk radio, news channels tapped into legitimate working-class anger. But here's the crucial part. They redirected it.
How so?
Instead of focusing that anger on, say, corporate power or economic policies causing inequality, they defined the elite as liberals, people supposedly responsible for declining values. So the focus shifted away from economic exploitation towards cultural issues. It effectively diverted attention from systemic economic problems, leading people to, well, sometimes vote against their own economic self-interest. It shows how powerful framing can be.
Wow. That's a really striking example of diverting anger and confusing the issue. Okay, let's pivot slightly, but stay on economic disadvantage. Poverty. The sources mention two main types, right? Absolute and relative. Can you break those down for us? Why does this distinction matter, especially for someone going into medicine?
Yeah, understanding this difference is really fundamental. Absolute poverty is, well, absolute. It's the severe lack of basic resources needed just to survive. We're talking food, shelter, clean water, the absolute essentials. When someone's in absolute poverty, their life is genuinely at risk.
So immediate survival is the issue.
Exactly. Medically, that translates to acute crises. Severe malnutrition, exposure, infectious diseases linked to poor sanitation. Intervention is literally life-saving.
Okay, critical life and death stuff. What about relative poverty then?
Relative poverty is different. It's defined in comparison to others in the same society. Someone in relative poverty might have their basic survival needs met. They have food, a roof over their head. But they have significantly fewer resources than the average person or family in their community. This gap leads to social exclusion, feeling left out, unable to participate fully in society.
Ah, so it's about the gap, the comparison.
Right. For a doctor, relative poverty might show up differently, maybe as chronic stress from financial worry, mental health issues linked to feeling excluded, or maybe just not being able to afford the kind of preventative care or treatments that are standard for wealthier people in that same town. It's less about immediate survival, more about long-term well-being and opportunity.
And the example used in the source, that family living paycheck to paycheck in a rich suburb, that really highlights it. They're not starving, they have a house, so not absolute poverty, but
Mhm.
compared to their neighbors with huge houses, fancy cars, sending kids to private schools.
Exactly. They feel poor, even if they're not destitute by global standards. That feeling of being on the outside looking in, that social exclusion, it has real consequences. It tells us poverty isn't just about lacking material things, it's also about dignity, mental health, being able to participate, all things that deeply affect a person's health.
That idea of relative poverty, feeling poor compared to your neighbors, really leads us nicely into how geography itself, like where you live, creates inequality. So, spatial inequality, unequal access based purely on location. It's not just what you have, but where you are. How does this play out in cities, Dr. Carter, especially with residential segregation?
It's a huge factor. Residential segregation, drawing from places like Khan Academy, is basically the uneven distribution of different groups across a geographic area, who lives where and why those patterns stick. And when you get more specific, there's concentration. That's when you see different groups clustered together in particular spots within a larger area.
Like different corners of the same neighborhood being distinct groups, little pockets.
Exactly like pockets. And then there's centralization, which is a specific type where that clustering happens right in the middle, the geographic or downtown center of a metropolitan area. Maybe certain groups are concentrated in the inner city.
Okay. And how do we even measure how segregated a place is?
There's a tool called the Index of Dissimilarity. It's a scale, 0 to 100. 0 means total segregation groups live in completely separate areas. 100 means perfect integration. Everyone's evenly spread out. So if you imagine that city with only red people in one part and only blue people in another, completely separate, they'd score close to 0. It gives us a number to quantify that separation.
That makes it very clear. And connecting this to the bigger picture, these patterns seem tied to major economic shifts, right? Like the decline of manufacturing.
Oh, absolutely. Historically, think about the mid-20th century onwards. Manufacturing declined in North America. In Europe, that wasn't just an economic shift. It hit cities hard. Manufacturing had often meant urban growth, a growing working middle class. Its decline led to the urban crisis, jobs disappeared, the middle class shrank, cities faced huge challenges.
And the comeback some cities have had, driven by tech, the information economy, that hasn't fixed things for everyone, has it? It seems like it created new divides.
Not at all. The revival has been incredibly uneven. You get these superstar cities, your New Yorks, your Silicon Valleys. But for every one of those, there are many other cities still reeling from deindustrialization, places where the jobs just never came back.
And this isn't just a U.S. thing.
No, you see shrinking cities or struggling regions in Germany, other parts of Europe, Japan, South Korea too, often made worse by low birth rates. And even within the cities that did boom again, who benefited, often not everyone equally. We see this bimodal income distribution,
Yeah.
meaning lots of people at the very high end, lots at the low end, but the middle is hollowed out. You get a bifurcated workforce, high skill, high pay jobs, or low skill, low pay service jobs. It creates a really polarized social structure.
Polarized. Can you give us some numbers to make that real? How divided are we talking?
Sure. Take New York City, 2016 data. The top 1% of earners, they took home 40% of all income in the city, 40%.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the entire bottom half, 50% of the population, they shared just 6%.
That is stark.
It is. And nationally, looking at wealth, which is even more concentrated by 2014, the top 0.1% in the U.S. owned as much wealth as the bottom 90%. And their share had more than doubled since 1980. So even when the economy grows, the gains are often funneling straight to the top, making inequality worse, not better.
So it's all connected. Where jobs are versus where people can afford to live, that spatial mismatch, the segregation we talked about, and then things like food deserts. They're all tangled up together in urban inequality.
Absolutely. It's a web. And this web is embedded in bigger trends like globalization, technological change. Globalization, especially, has really reshaped cities, often intensifying inequality within them. Policies associated with globalization, often called neoliberal policies, raise real concerns about growing inequality too. Though the exact patterns can look different, even between big global cities, say Beijing versus London, local factors matter too.
And the housing market itself, it's not just a place to live, it's a huge driver of this inequality, isn't it?
A massive driver. Think about it.
Yeah.
More expensive houses are usually in areas with better amenities, good schools, parks, safety, transit. These desirable things push prices up. On the flip side, negative amenities, things like high crime rates, pollution, lack of services, they push prices down.
So your income dictates the kind of environment you live in.
Pretty directly, yes. Wealthier people can afford the better houses in the better neighborhoods. Poorer people are priced out. This reinforces segregation, makes it harder to climb the ladder. Those desirable amenities, because they increase housing costs, actually end up concentrating affordability issues, making it harder for low-income folks to access those good things. The extreme outcome: lack of affordable housing leads to homelessness, to slums, terrible living conditions that trap people. And we see this globally, like in Chinese cities, where access to good schools or the subway now has an even bigger impact on housing prices than maybe in the West.
And what about people who rent? That's crucial for many low-income families, migrants. Does that market help or hurt?
Often, it exacerbates things. Developers are driven by profit, right? So building cheap rental housing isn't always their priority. Affordable rentals can be scarce. Plus, you can have discrimination in the rental market. And renters often don't have the same rights or access as homeowners. Like the example from China with the hukou system. Even if you rent in a good school district, your kid might not be able to go to that public school because of your registration status. This creates what some call housing poverty, especially in downtown areas where jobs are concentrated, but rents are sky high relative to wages.
And the environment around the housing matters hugely too. Environmental injustice. You mentioned higher asthma rates in low-income minority areas near highways. As a future doctor, you really need to know this stuff, right? Prescribing "go play outside" means something different if outside is next to a polluting factory or a busy road.
Exactly. And it's not always the big smokestacks. Research shows that traffic, cars, trucks, smaller pollution sources, they might actually be a bigger health problem in core neighborhoods. Busy roads mean air pollution, sure, but also noise pollution. And studies show the closer you live, the worse the health impacts. It's a clear link. Then there's access to green space parks, trees. Again, poorer communities often lose out. Maybe they're in crowded areas with no land for parks, or maybe the local government just doesn't have the funds to create or maintain them.
And those green spaces aren't just nice to look at.
No, they're vital for physical activity, mental well-being, and they actually help reduce local air pollution. Lack of access is a real public health issue rooted in inequality.
Which leads us to another access issue: food deserts. Can you define that again, maybe paint a clearer picture?
Sure. A food desert is basically an area where residents have limited access to affordable, healthy food options. Think fresh fruits, vegetables, lean proteins. It happens because of how stores are distributed. You might have plenty of convenience stores selling processed snacks and sugary drinks, maybe fast food chains, but no proper grocery store for miles.
So even if you want to eat healthy and maybe even have the money, you physically can't easily buy the right foods.
Precisely. The impact is predictable. Higher rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, other chronic conditions tied to poor diet. Imagine your only options nearby are a gas station mini-mart or a corner store with dusty cans. It forces unhealthy choices.
Is this mainly a U.S. problem, or do we see it elsewhere?
Most of the research has been in the U.S., so we need to be careful about generalizing. The patterns might look different elsewhere, but the underlying issue of unequal access exists globally. There was that interesting study in Barcelona, for example. It found that while general access to food stools was fairly equal across the city, access to organic food was clearly linked to socioeconomic status. The wealthier areas had the organic shops.
So even where basic access seems okay, there can be deeper inequalities in accessing healthier or preferred options.
Exactly. It shows the complexity. It's not always about having no food nearby. Sometimes it's about the quality and type of food available, and that often mirrors the socioeconomic landscape.
Okay, let's pull the lens back even further now. Look at the global scale. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? We're drowning in data, yet basic info on how economic growth actually gets shared. It's often missing. We hear GDP numbers, but who's really benefiting? Having transparent data on inequality, it's like a global public good we desperately need.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the data we do have, like from the World Inequality Report 2022, well, it paints a pretty shocking picture of global income and wealth inequality using 2021 figures. Let's start with wealth, assets, property, stocks, all that. The poorest half of the entire global population, they own just 2% of total global wealth.
2% for half the people on the planet.
2%. On average, that's about €2,900 per adult, adjusting for purchasing power. Now compare that to the richest 10%. They own 76% of all wealth. 76%.
Wow.
Their average.
Yeah.
€550,900 per adult. The concentration is just immense. We're far closer to total wealth inequality than equality.
That is a staggering gap in wealth. What about income? Is that distributed any more evenly?
That's a bit less extreme than wealth, but still profoundly unequal. The global bottom 50%, they get only 8% of total global income. That averages out to about €2,800, or like €230 a month per person. Meanwhile, the global top 10%, they rake in 52% of all income. Their average is 87,200 years a year, or 7,300 a month, over 5 times the global average income.
So yeah, income is also massively concentrated at the top. And the scary part is wealth generates more wealth, right? It gives you power, influence. It's not just that the rich are rich, they're positioned to get even richer faster than everyone else.
That's the snowball effect. Wealth is a major source of future gains. And the data shows this clearly. Between 1995 and 2021, think about all the wealth created globally. The top 1% captured 38% of that growth. The bottom 50%. They captured a, frankly, frightening 2%.
Just 2% of the growth for half the world?
Yeah. During that same period, the share of wealth held by just the top 0.1% went from 7% to 11%. And global billionaire wealth, it just soared. The concentration of economic power in the hands of the super rich is a defining feature of our time. But here's a really critical takeaway from all this data, Jenny. Inequality isn't just inevitable. It's not a natural consequence of economic growth. It's fundamentally a political choice. How do we know? Because average national income doesn't reliably predict how unequal a country is.
What do you mean? Give us an example.
Okay, look at Europe and the U.S. Roughly similar average incomes, right? But Europe, generally speaking, is much more equal in how income is distributed compared to the U.S., which is very unequal. Or compare Brazil and India, extremely unequal, with places like Malaysia or Uruguay, which have moderate to low inequality despite different income levels. Shows different paths are possible.
And we have seen inequality rise almost everywhere since the 80s, often linked to policies like deregulation, liberalization.
True, there's been a general upward trend globally since the 1980s. But, and this is key, the rate of that rise has varied hugely. Some countries saw spectacular increases. The US, Russia, India come to mind. Others, like many European countries or China, saw smaller rises. This variation really hammers home the point. Inequality isn't fate. It's a result of policy choices. How governments tax, regulate, invest.
Yeah.
It all shapes the outcome.
And one big shift related to policy has been this move from public wealth to private wealth, right? Like governments owning less, private individuals and corporations owning more.
Exactly. That's been driven by deregulation, big privatization drives, sometimes rising government debt, forcing asset sales. And at the same time, private wealth itself has become more concentrated. Especially at the very, very top, the billionaire class has seen massive gains. This transfer from public to private has often disproportionately benefited really small groups. Think about the rise of oligarchs in Russia after privatization, for instance. It changes who controls the economic levers.
Okay, let's switch gears to another major dimension. Gender inequality, still a huge issue globally. What's the picture regarding women's share of labor income?
Well, the global female share of labor income is currently just under 35%. That is an increase from around 31% back in 1990, so there's been some progress.
But still less than 35%.
Right. It means, on average, men still earn roughly twice as much as women globally. So despite progress, we're nowhere near parity. Systemic barriers to equal pay and opportunity clearly persist.
And this gap gets worse at the top, doesn't it? That glass ceiling seems very real in the income data.
Very real. Women are significantly underrepresented in the highest paying jobs. The wage gap actually tends to widen as you go up the income ladder. It's largely because there just aren't enough women in those top positions. Interestingly, some emerging economies like Brazil or Spain actually have better female representation in the top 1% than some advanced economies like the U.S.
Really? Why might that be?
Well, one theory about the U.S. specifically is the temporal inflexibility of many top jobs. They demand incredibly long, often unpredictable hours, which disproportionately disadvantages women who still shoulder the majority of childcare and household responsibilities. It makes climbing that final ladder rung much harder.
Beyond just income, the UN has that Gender Inequality Index, the GII. It looks broader labor market participation, health outcomes like maternal mortality, and empowerment like education and political seats. What does that tell us?
The GII shows overall improvement between 1995 and about 2010. That progress was mainly driven by gains in education girls catching up in school enrollment and health, especially the big drop in maternal mortality rates.
But what happened after 2010?
Progress kind of stalled. It slowed down significantly, which is worrying. It might suggest that the easier gains, the low-hanging fruit, have been achieved, but tackling the deeper, more systemic barriers to gender equality is proving much harder.
And even with that earlier progress, huge gaps remain between regions, right?
Oh, absolutely huge. Maternal mortality, for example. The rate in sub-Saharan Africa can be 20 times higher than in Europe or Central Asia. 20 times. That reflects massive disparities in basic healthcare access for women. and political representation. Women are still hugely underrepresented in parliaments everywhere, rich or poor countries. The best regions still only have about twice the representation as the worst. It shows that progress in one area, like education, doesn't automatically translate into equality across the board, especially in political power. It's definitely a multi-front battle.
Okay, last dimension for this global section, carbon inequality. This feels like a newer way of looking at disparity, but incredibly important with climate change. We release billions of tons of CO2, but it's not everyone contributing equally, is it?
Not even close. The averages mask enormous differences. Look at 2019 data. North America averages almost 21 tons of CO2 per person per year.
21 tons.
Yeah. That's over 3 times the global average and over 6 times what's considered sustainable for a 2°C warming limit. Now compare that to sub-Saharan Africa. Just 1.6 tons per person.
Wow, huge difference.
Massive. Europe, Russia, Central Asia are somewhere in the middle, maybe 7.5 to 10 tons. It clearly shows wealthier regions have much larger carbon footprints due to higher consumption levels.
And we need to be careful about how we measure this, right? Territorial emissions versus carbon footprints, because countries can kind of offshore their pollution.
That's a critical point. Territorial emissions just count what's produced inside a country's borders. Carbon footprints try to account for the emissions embedded in everything we consume, including imported goods. So a country might look like it's lowering its emissions because it closed factories. But if it's just importing those same goods from somewhere else now, its footprint might not have changed much or could even be higher.
Like the Europe example.
Exactly. Europe's carbon footprint is estimated to be about 25% higher than its territorial emissions. That difference is largely emissions embedded in goods imported from places like China. It reveals how high-income countries can externalize their environmental impact.
So who are the biggest emitters overall? Is it just about rich countries versus poor countries?
It's more nuanced now. Globally, the top 10% of individual emitters are responsible for almost half, 47.6% of all global emissions. Their average footprint is huge, around 31 tons, the bottom 50% of the world's population. They contribute only 12% of emissions, averaging just 1.6 tons. And emissions from the very top, the top 1%, have actually risen substantially since 1990.
But you said it's more nuanced now. What's the big shift?
The really crucial shift is this. Inequality within countries now accounts for more of the global carbon inequality than the inequality between countries.
Wait, say that again?
Okay, back in 1990, most of the difference in emissions globally was explained by the gap between rich countries and poor countries. But now, almost 2/3 of global carbon inequality is due to the gaps within individual countries. Meaning, the difference between the richest and poorest people's emissions inside the US or inside China or inside India is now a bigger driver of the global total inequality than the difference between the average American and the average Indian.
That's profound. It means tackling climate change isn't just about international agreements. It's deeply tied to domestic inequality, too.
Exactly. It changes how we need to think about climate policy, climate justice. The biggest emitters are the wealthy, wherever they live.
Okay, we've laid out a lot of the problems, the deep inequalities. Now let's talk solutions. Pathways forward. For our listeners, especially future doctors, the idea of social determinants of health, SDOH, is key. The WHO definition is powerful. The circumstances you're born into, grow up in, live, work, and age in, all shaped by money, power, resources. How do we actually use this understanding, Dr. Carter?
That understanding is the foundation. And we see practical applications in things like CDC initiatives that focus on multi-sector partnerships. They're trying to improve health outcomes by directly tackling these SDOH. One approach they highlight is called Getting Further Faster, or GFF. It's a way to quickly look back and see what makes community partnerships successful in fighting chronic diseases.
And these partnerships involve more than just doctors and hospitals, right?
Oh yeah, much broader. We're talking community health groups, businesses, schools, local government, healthcare systems, even urban planners. It really requires collaboration across sectors.
Makes sense. You can't fix housing issues from inside a clinic alone.
Precisely. Health departments are key players. They were involved in almost all the partnerships studied. And working closely with healthcare providers is crucial for tracking outcomes using electronic health records that gives you the data to see if what you're doing is actually working. Another finding. These things take time. Partnerships that have been running for 4 to 10 years had better results. It suggests sustained effort is needed, not just short-term projects.
So patience and persistence.
Right. And for those supporting these efforts, encourage involving health departments, find local champions, leverage state resources, And set realistic goals. Big changes take time, so celebrating the small wins along the way is really important to keep everyone motivated.
Okay, so collaboration is key. Now, education often comes up as a way to improve socioeconomic standing, a key SDOH. But it seems like family background still casts a really long shadow.
It absolutely does. The sources are clear. Coming from a wealthy family significantly boosts your chances of not just going to college, but graduating. Often, that family background matters more for educational and job outcomes than extra support services provided by schools. So this idea that education alone can fix income inequality and poverty, well, the evidence suggests it hasn't really worked out that way.
So education isn't the magic bullet.
It's vital, absolutely. But it's not enough by itself. You also need things like higher wages for low-income jobs, supportive social policies, affordable childcare, housing assistance, etc., to really level the playing field and help families thrive. It needs to be a package deal.
And this all ties back to economic power, right? Having money isn't just about buying things, it's about having choices, having influence.
That's fundamental. Economic power translates directly into status and influence. Higher SES means more power. Think about employment. Your job gives you income, and that income dictates huge life choices. Where you live, what kind of childcare you can access, the schools your kids attend, the medical care you get, even the food you put on the table.
The stress of having to choose between rent and medicine, that's lack of economic power made real.
Exactly. And these power dynamics pop up everywhere, even in schools who decides the curriculum. Teachers, school boards, national standards, often reflecting the priorities of those with more economic clout, shifting to healthcare systems themselves. Crises like COVID really threw the unequal access into sharp relief globally. It exposed weaknesses. And what's really alarming is that even before the pandemic, public health spending in low-income countries had actually been decreasing between 2006 and 2018, while it was going up in wealthier OECD countries and middle-income nations.
So the gap was widening even before the crisis hit. How did poorer countries manage?
Well, largely through increased out-of-pocket spending by individuals. People had to pay more themselves to make up for the lack of public funding.
Which hurts the poorest the most.
Exactly. It puts the burden squarely on vulnerable populations. And why are these systems so weak? It's complex lack of resources, yes, but also imbalances in global finance and sometimes the lingering effects of past policies. Things like structural adjustment programs from the IMF and World Bank in previous decades are argued by some to have led to underinvestment in health systems, making them less resilient when crises like Ebola or COVID hit.
Okay, so if we want stronger systems, more equality, taxation seems like a key lever for governments to redistribute resources. But you mentioned earlier that wealth taxes are often archaic.
Yeah, it's quite striking. Many places still rely heavily on flat property taxes for taxing wealth. Everyone pays the same rate on their property value, regardless of their total net worth, even if they have a big mortgage. This is completely different from modern income taxes, which are usually progressive. The more you earn, the higher rate you pay. There's really no good economic reason today not to have progressive taxes on overall wealth, just like we do on income. The flat system is unfair and helps inequality grow.
So what would a modern, progressive, global wealth tax look like? The sources had some scenarios, right?
They did. The World Inequality Report modeled a few possibilities. A low scenario might generate revenue equal to 1.6% of global income, still significant. A higher scenario could involve, say, a 1% tax on wealth between $1 million and $10 million, but then steeper rates above that, maybe 5% on wealth between $1 billion and $10 billion, up to 10% over $100 billion.
Would billionaires still get richer under that?
Potentially, yes. Given average wealth growth rates, even after paying a tax like that, their wealth could still increase by 1–2% per year. And this scenario could raise revenue equal to 2.1% of global income.
And the most ambitious one.
The very high scenario. Similar rates at the lower millionaire end, but really steep taxes at the top, like 50% over $10 billion, 90% over $100 billion. This would basically stop extreme wealth accumulation above a certain point. And it could generate a huge amount, maybe 5.3% of global income. The key point, though, isn't just the revenue number. It's what you do with it. If that money is reinvested in education, healthcare, green infrastructure, it boosts society's overall well-being and potential. Even a moderate wealth tax could boost global public health spending by 25%. Imagine that impact.
And it's not just personal wealth. Corporate taxes matter too, right? You said they act as a kind of backstop, especially in the U.S.
They do. Corporate tax tends to be progressive because wealthier people own more corporate stock. It stops them from just setting up a personal company to report their income and pay a lower corporate rate instead of the higher personal income tax rate. They emerge together for a reason.
But we're seeing corporate tax rates fall globally. That race to the bottom, why is that bad?
It's bad for several reasons. One, less government revenue, right when it's often needed most. Two, it makes the whole tax system less progressive, shifting the burden. Three, it undermines the ability to even have progressive income taxes if the wealthy can just easily sidestep them through corporations. Stopping that race to the bottom is crucial.
Are there efforts to stop it, like that global minimum tax idea?
Yes, there are proposals, like a 15% minimum effective tax rate on multinational profits. That could bring in significant revenue, especially for developed countries. But there are concerns, too. Some proposals include these private arbitration systems where corporations could challenge tax bills secretly. Based on past experience with investment treaties, these systems can sometimes favor corporations over governments. Using established international public law systems might be better.
And finally, tax evasion, hiding wealth offshore. The sources suggest a global asset register as the best fix. How would that work against these opaque systems?
It's a bold idea, but maybe necessary. The financial system is still incredibly opaque. Things like omnibus accounts used by big financial institutions, they hide the ultimate owner of stocks and bonds, only showing the intermediary bank or broker.
Making it easy to hide money.
Exactly. Tax evaders use complex webs of trusts, shell companies. A global financial register that tracks actual beneficial ownership could cut through that. Maybe it means getting rid of omnibus accounts, setting new standards for information sharing, or even using technology like blockchain to create a transparent, traceable record of who owns what. It would make hiding wealth much, much harder. And this brings us to a final point, Jenny, ending these deep imbalances between the global center and periphery. It means rethinking some core assumptions of globalization that have allowed capital and income to flow disproportionately from the global south to the north.
So making globalization fairer, essentially, yes. Grounded in the principle that every person deserves equal rights to develop their potential, starting with equal access to basic education and healthcare. How we fund that is a political choice. And given that the huge success of top global economic actors relies heavily on international markets and labor, well, there's a strong ethical case that some of the revenue from things like global wealth taxes should be redistributed globally, allocated partly to the global south to support development and reduce those historical imbalances. It's about sharing the gains of our interconnected world more equitably. Hashtag outro.
Wow, okay, that was truly a deep dive. We've covered so much ground defining social inequality, digging into class consciousness and that tricky idea of false consciousness, seeing how spatial inequality shapes everything from housing to health, plus those stark global numbers on wealth, income, gender, even carbon footprints. And finally, exploring potential solutions like progressive taxes and focusing on social determinants. It really underscores how these systemic forces shape our world and our individual lives in profound ways. Absolutely, Jenny. And for everyone listening, especially you future doctors, I hope this makes it clear why understanding social inequality isn't just, ticking a box for the MCAT. It's absolutely fundamental to being a good doctor. You will see these issues walk into your clinic every single day. Patients whose health is impacted by where they live, what they eat, the stress of low wages. Recognizing the system behind the symptoms that lets you advocate better, treat more holistically, and maybe even contribute to changing those systems. It makes you a more effective healer.
Perfectly said. And maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, building on that idea that inequality is a choice. If we accept that, if we really understand that these disparities aren't inevitable but are results of policies, what responsibility does that place on us? As informed citizens, as future leaders, especially in healthcare, what's our role in reshaping these systems to build a fairer, more just world?
That's the question to ponder. Think about your own community, your future practice. Where could you make a difference? What could you advocate for?
A great challenge to consider. And one last reminder, for more PsychSoc insights for your MCAT prep, do check out the MCAT Psych Pulse podcast on mdtalk.substack.com. Dr. Jordan Carter, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and guiding us through this incredibly important topic today.
It was my pleasure, Jenny. Really important conversation.